I woke up from a strange sound, as if someone was scratching the walls of our house. The clock showed 3:30 in the morning, and it was pitch black outside. The sound was repeated, and I realized that it was coming not from outside, but from inside, from the wall between the bedroom and the living room. My wife Helen was sleeping next to me, not moving, although she usually woke up from any rustle. I carefully got out of bed, trying not to creak the floorboards, and walked towards the source of the sound. The room felt strange in the darkness, even though we had only moved into this house on the outskirts of Millfield 3 months earlier. The old Victorian had been sold for next to nothing, having been empty for too long, and the local estate agents had given up hope of selling it. Now I knew why. The sound grew louder. Something was definitely moving inside the wall. I put my ear to the wallpaper and heard not just a scraping sound, but a whole symphony of rustling, scratching, and whispering? No. It was more like the rustling of leaves or grass swaying in the wind. But where would grass come from in the wall? Suddenly, everything went quiet. The silence fell upon the house with such force that my ears began to ring. I stepped back from the wall and almost screamed. There was a figure standing in the semi-darkness of the living room. Tall, motionless. It was standing by the far window, its back to me. At first I thought it was Helen, but then I remembered that I had left her in bed. Besides, the figure was too tall for my wife. "Who's there?" I whispered. But there was no answer. I fumbled for the switch on the floor lamp and flicked it. Bright light flooded the room, and I saw that there was no one in it. Only the curtains fluttered by the open window, although I clearly remembered closing it before going to bed. Cold air rushed into the house, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and something else, a woody, almost putrid aroma. I walked to the window and looked out. Our property bordered a forest, a dense, dark stand of trees that the locals called the Old Forest. During the day it looked like an ordinary pine forest, but now, in the pre-dawn darkness, shadows were flickering between the trunks. They did not move chaotically, but seemed to follow a certain plan, moving from tree to tree in the direction of our house. I slammed the window shut and bolted it. Helen was still asleep, and I decided not to wake her. In the morning, it would all seem like a silly figment of my imagination. But when I returned to the bedroom, the bed was empty. The sheets lay neatly straightened. The pillow was unpressed, as if no one had slept there. "Helen," I called, but the house only echoed. I went through all the rooms on the first floor, then up to the second. Helen was nowhere to be found. Her clothes were hanging in the closet. Her car keys were on the dresser. Her purse was by the front door. She couldn't have left, but she wasn't in the house either. It was impossible. Returning to the living room, I noticed that the wall from which the sounds were coming looked different. The wallpaper was bulging in one place, as if something was pressing on it from the inside. I ran my hand over the surface and felt that the wall there was soft, almost spongy. When I pressed harder, my fingers fell through the wallpaper, and the same forest smell came out of the hole. Tearing the wallpaper with my hands, I discovered that there was no brick or wood behind it. Instead of a wall, there was a gaping hole leading into absolute darkness. Cold air flowed out of it, bringing the whisper of leaves and a voice. Faint, barely audible, but definitely Helen's voice. "Help me," came from the darkness.
"I can't find my way home."
Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crawled into the hole. It was wide enough for me to squeeze through, and it led not into the wall but down into the side. The beam of the flashlight picked out tree roots, damp earth, and rocks from the darkness. I crawled through a narrow tunnel that was clearly not man-made. Its walls were made of intertwined roots and compacted soil. The tunnel gradually widened, and soon I was able to stand up to my full height. The flashlight illuminated a strange underground gallery, the walls of which were completely covered with the roots of various plants. Some roots were as thick as my arm, others as thin as hair. But they were all intertwined in a complex pattern, reminiscent of the circulatory system of a giant organism. "Helen!" I shouted, and my voice was drowned out in the thick silence of the dungeon. The only answer I got was a quiet rustling sound. The roots were slowly moving, as if reacting to my presence. I walked further along the gallery, which gradually rose upward. The air became fresher, and soon I discerned a faint light ahead. A few more steps, and I came out from under the ground. A forest stretched out before me, but not the one that grew behind our house. The trees here were huge, ancient, their trunks reaching incredible thickness. The crowns closed so tightly that the sky was almost invisible, and only rare rays of sun broke through the foliage, creating a bizarre play of light and shadow. The strangest thing was that the sun was shining, although on the surface it should have been deep night. I looked back and saw that the exit of the tunnel was in the roots of a giant oak tree. The tree was so old that its trunk seemed more like a rock covered in bark. On the bark were strange symbols, not carved, but as if they had grown with the tree. They resembled runes, but I could not make out their meaning. There was a special silence in this forest, not dead, but filled with expectation. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the flow of a stream nearby, the chirping of birds. But all these sounds seemed muffled, as if they were coming from far away. And among them, barely distinguishable, was Helen's voice, calling me. I followed the sound, making my way between the huge trunks. Leaves rustled under my feet, not autumn yellow but green, fresh, as if they had just fallen. The further I went into the forest, the more unreal it became. The trees took on bizarre shapes, their branches intertwined in complex knots. Trunks bent in impossible spirals. Roots rose from the ground in bizarre arches. Soon I came to a small clearing, in the center of which stood a stone. Not an ordinary boulder, but a properly processed monolith with smooth edges. On its surface were carved the same symbols that I had seen on the oak, but here they formed a complex pattern reminiscent of a map or a diagram. At the base of the stone grew flowers of amazing beauty. Their petals shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow, although the plants themselves seemed to be ordinary forest violets. "You found me," I heard Helen's voice. I turned around and saw her standing at the edge of the clearing. She was the same as always. Shoulder-length brown hair, green eyes, a smile that made my heart beat faster. But something was wrong about her. She stood too still, and her gaze seemed empty, as if she were looking not at me but through me. "Helen, what happened? How did you end up here?" I took a step towards her, but she raised her hand, stopping me. "Don't come any closer," she said, and there was a strange mechanical note in her voice. "I can't control myself here. The forest. It changes us." "What are you talking about? Let's go home. I know the way back." "The way back?" Helen laughed, but the laugh was unnatural, too high. "There is no way back here. There is only a way in." She pointed behind her, and I saw that the clearing did not end at the edge of the forest, as I had first thought. Behind Helen, new rows of trees stretched out, even more ancient and bizarre, and in the depths, barely discernible between the trunks, some buildings loomed. Not modern houses, but something older. Stone. "What is this place?" I whispered. "The old forest shows its true colors," Helen replied. Did you think we just moved into a house next to a small forest? But this forest is older than any human settlement. It remembers the times when those who knew its secrets lived here. As she spoke, her appearance began to change. Her skin began to pale, taking on a greenish tint, and her hair darkened to the color of moss. But the most eerie thing was her eyes. The green irises dilated, swallowing up the pupils and whites, turning into a solid emerald surface. "The forest is hungry," she continued, and now her voice sounded like the rustling of leaves. "For a long time it ate only small animals, birds, the occasional mushroom picker. But when we moved into the house, it felt the opportunity to get more. I backed up toward the monolith, but tripped over its base and fell. The flowers growing around the stone were not as harmless as they seemed. Their stems were covered in sharp thorns that dug into my clothes and skin. But instead of pain, I felt a strange numbness spreading through my body. These flowers are called the blood of the forest," Helen explained, slowly approaching me. "Their poison does not kill, but transforms. Soon you will understand how wonderful it is to become part of something greater, ancient, eternal." The numbness had reached my head, and my thoughts were becoming confused. But in a last moment of clarity, I remembered the flashlight in my hand. I pointed the beam at Helen, and she screamed, covering her face with her hands. Where the light had touched her skin, dark spots appeared, as if from burns. "Light," she hissed. "Real light hurts us here." I realized that the soft light in the forest was not sunlight, but something else, perhaps the phosphorescence of plants, or some other natural phenomenon. But the electric light of the torch was alien, hostile to this place. Gathering my remaining strength, I tore at the stems of the flowers, tearing the fabric of my jacket, and jumped to my feet. Helen retreated, still shielding her face from the light, and I took advantage of this to escape. But instead of looking for a way back to the oak tree I had come through, I ran in the opposite direction, toward where the stone buildings were visible. The effect of the flower poison gradually wore off, but it left behind strange sensations. I began to hear the forest differently. Not just the rustling of leaves and the crackling of branches, but entire conversations. The trees spoke to each other in the language of rustlings and creaks, discussing my appearance. Some seemed curious, others hostile, others simply indifferent. The buildings I was approaching turned out to be the ruins of an ancient settlement. The stone houses were built in a style I couldn't place. Not quite medieval, but not primitive either. Their walls were covered in the same moss as the trees, and the roofs had long since collapsed, allowing the forest to grow through them. And yet, in some of the buildings, fire still burned, not the usual kind, but a greenish, cold one. I peered through a window into one of the houses and saw figures inside. They were sitting around a fireplace where that strange fire was burning, discussing something in hushed voices. On closer inspection, I realized that they were people, or had once been people. Their skin had the same greenish tint as Helen's, and their hair resembled moss and lichen. "A new one has arrived," one of them said without turning his head in my direction. "The forest brought him here." "He's still resisting," the other replied. "He carries the light with him, but it will pass." "Everything passes," agreed the third. "Time is different here. It heals any resistance." I walked away from the window and wandered further through the ruined settlement. In every house, there were similar creatures, former people who had adopted the nature of the forest. They did not try to stop me or harm me. They simply watched with gentle curiosity, as if they knew that sooner or later I would become one of them. At the center of the settlement stood the largest building, some kind of temple or assembly hall. Its walls were covered with carvings, depicting people turning into trees, animals becoming part of the earth, entire cities being swallowed up by the forest. And on top of the building grew a huge flower, just like the one surrounding the monolith, but the size of a man. Inside the temple, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were portraits on the walls, not painted but grown out of stone made of moss and lichen. I recognized some of the faces. They were people from Millfield, our neighbors, the local postman, the shop assistant, all of them who had disappeared in recent years. Beneath each portrait was a plaque with a name and a date. The oldest entry was from 1991, the newest from last month. And at the very end of the row was a blank rectangle with a plaque underneath it that read, Michael Harrison, October 2024. My name. We've been waiting for you for a long time. A familiar voice was heard. I turned to see Helen standing in the doorway. But she looked different now, more harmonious, as if she had finally accepted her new state. Her skin had acquired a beautiful shade of young foliage. Her hair flowed like seaweed in an undertow, and her eyes glowed with a soft green light. You knew, I said. You knew this would happen when we moved into that house. No, she shook her head. I only found out here. Les opened my eyes to many things. For example, that our marriage was not an accident. Les was directing events, leading us to move to Millfield. He is very patient and always gets what he wants. What does he want? Grow, Helen said simply. The old forest once covered this entire area. Then people came, cut it down, built cities. But the roots remained. They waited for their time underground, in the basements of houses, in sewer tunnels, and now the forest is returning. Slowly, carefully, one person at a time. I backed toward the back wall of the temple, but tripped over something soft. Turning around, I saw that the wall was covered in the same tangle of roots as the tunnel in our house. The roots were slowly moving, creating a hypnotic pattern. And suddenly I realized, these are not just roots. This is a nervous system. The entire forest was one giant organism, and we, humans, were turning into its cells. Don't be afraid, Helen said softly, approaching me. This is not death. This is the continuation of life in a new form. You will see with the eyes of the entire forest, think with its thoughts, feel a connection with all life on earth. What will happen to those who remain in the city? To our friends, relatives? The forest will expand, she replied with the same gentle smile. First Millfield, then the neighboring towns. The process will take years, maybe decades. But eventually everything will return to its original state, to the time when man and nature were one. The roots on the wall began to move faster, reaching out towards me in thin tendrils. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed the beam at them. The roots recoiled with a hissing sound, and Helen screamed as if she had been hurt. You're only causing yourself pain, she said, holding on to the wall. Light can slow the process down, but the batteries in a flashlight don't last forever. And the forest is eternal. I realized she was right. The batteries were already running low. The light was fading. But instead of despair, I felt a strange calm. The poison of the flowers was still working, and with each passing minute, the idea of becoming part of the forest seemed more and more attractive. Why resist? Why return to the world of human vanity, when here you can find peace and harmony with nature? Yes, Helen whispered, as if reading my thoughts. You're starting to understand. Let go of the flashlight. Let the forest accept you. I almost agreed. My hand was already unclenching, ready to release the flashlight, when suddenly there was a roar of a motor outside. The sound was so out of place in this ancient silence that everyone, the roots on the walls, Helen and I, froze. Then there were voices, shouts, the sound of breaking branches. "Michael! Michael, are you there?" A familiar voice shouted. It was Dan McGregor, our next-door neighbor in Millfield, a mining engineer, a practical man who would never believe in mystical stories. But why was he here, in this unreal forest? "They shouldn't have found their way here," Helen hissed, and for the first time there was alarm in her voice. "The forest hides itself from prying eyes." The sounds were getting closer. I could hear several other voices besides Dan's. Sheriff Brennan, I think, and Fireman Tom Wilson. They must have organized a search party when they discovered that Helen and I were missing. "We need to go," Helen said, grabbing my hand. "Deeper into the forest, where they can't find us." But her touch was cold, lifeless. Where she touched my skin, thin green threads began to sprout, roots that tried to penetrate my flesh. I pulled my hand back and pointed the flashlight at her. Helen stepped back with a hiss. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Those people can't help you. The forest has already marked you. Wherever you are, it will find a way to finish what it started." "Michael!" Dan's voice sounded very close. I ran out of the temple and saw a powerful searchlight beam piercing through the trees. The search party was armed with modern flashlights, and their bright light made the forest retreat. Where the beams fell, ancient trees looked like ordinary pines and birches, and bizarre buildings turned into piles of mossy stones. "Here!" I shouted, waving my flashlight. "I'm here!" Dan ran into the clearing first, followed by the sheriff and two other men I didn't recognize. In the light of their flashlights, all the unreality of the forest began to dissipate like fog. The monolith turned into an ordinary boulder. The forest blood flowers into simple forest violets. And the ancient settlement disappeared, leaving behind only a few granite boulders scattered among the trees. "Michael, damn it. We've been looking for you all night." Dan grabbed my shoulders. "Where's Helen? The neighbors saw you go into the woods last night and never come back." I looked around for my wife, but she was nowhere to be seen. In the bright light of the electric lanterns, the forest looked completely ordinary. A small grove on the outskirts of the city where locals sometimes picked mushrooms and berries. No ancient giants, no stone temples, no creatures with green skin. I began, but stopped. How to explain something I barely believed myself? She went further, deeper into the forest. She said she wanted to stay here. Sheriff Brennan frowned. "What do you mean, stay?" "Michael, you don't look so good. Do you need medical attention?" I looked at my hands and was horrified. There were thin green lines on my skin, marks from the roots that were trying to grow into my flesh. In the light of the lanterns, they looked like ordinary scratches from branches, but I knew they were not. "Yes," I muttered. "I should probably see a doctor." We were led out of the forest to the cars parked on the forest road. As we walked, I glanced back several times, but saw only ordinary trees in the light of the street lamps. And yet it seemed to me that someone was watching us from the darkness. A multitude of eyes, green as emeralds and patient as eternity itself. At Millfield Hospital, I was seen by Dr. Henderson, who found nothing serious. He treated the scratches on my hands with antiseptic and gave me a tetanus shot. When I told him what had happened in the woods, he dismissed them as symptoms of stress and fatigue, prescribing sedatives and advising me to get a good night's sleep. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Helen again. Not the green-skinned creature from the forest, but my real wife, as she had been yesterday morning. Where was she now? Was she alive? Or was it all a hallucination caused by some fungus or plant? The next day, search parties combed the woods for hours, but found no trace of Helen. Sheriff Brennan opened a missing persons case, but it was obvious that he thought it was just a simple case, a woman who had left her husband and was hiding somewhere in town with friends or relatives. I returned to our house, but I could not stand it. The hole in the living room wall was gone. There was ordinary wallpaper again, slightly faded but whole. I felt the wall, but it was solid, made of brick and plaster. No tunnels leading to underground galleries. A week passed, then another. The search for Helen was abandoned for lack of leads.
Her photo hung at the sheriff's station and in several stores in town, but no one had seen her since that night in the woods. Officially, she was listed as missing. Meanwhile, I began to notice strange changes in myself. The green lines on my skin did not disappear, despite treatment. Moreover, they slowly expanded, turning into intricate patterns resembling fern leaves. Dr. Henderson suggested that this was an allergic reaction to some plant, but no ointments or medications helped. I also began to hear the forest differently. Even inside the house, with the windows closed, I could hear the whispers of the trees, their leisurely conversations about the weather, the changing seasons, the lives of small creatures in their roots and branches. At first, it was interesting, even fascinating. But gradually the voices became louder, more insistent. They were calling me back.
A month after Helen disappeared, I made what many considered a crazy decision. I sold the house in Millfield and moved to Seattle, away from the old forest, away from the whispering voices that haunted me day and night. I got a job at an architectural firm, rented a small apartment downtown, and tried to start a new life. For the first few weeks, the plan seemed to be working. The noise of the city drowned out the forest voices, and the stress of work left little time to reflect on what had happened. The green patterns on my skin began to fade, though they did not disappear completely. The doctor I saw in Seattle suggested a rare form of dermatitis brought on by stress. But the forest hadn't forgotten me. The first sign was the plants in my apartment. I didn't buy them, they just kept appearing. First a small fern in the bathroom, then ivy on the kitchen window, then moss that started growing on the walls and the corners where moisture usually collects. The building manager assured me there were no problems with dampness, but the plants kept appearing and growing. I tried to get rid of them, but it was useless. The next day, after I threw away the pots with plants, they returned, sometimes in the same place, sometimes in other rooms. Neighbors began to complain about a strange forest smell coming from my apartment, although I did not smell it. And then the dreams began. Every night I returned to that ancient forest, where time flowed differently. I saw Helen, but now she was not alone. Other creatures were gathering around her, those whom the forest had accepted earlier. They were building something grandiose, not from stone or wood, but from living matter. Roots, branches, and vines intertwined in complex structures, creating new buildings, roads, entire cities. "We are preparing a place for those who will come after," Helen told me in a dream. "The old world is dying, Michael. Concrete and asphalt will not last forever, but the forest will live forever." I would wake up in a cold sweat and discover that the plants in my apartment had grown even more during the night. Fern roots had grown through the cracks in the floor, ivy had entwined the furniture, and moss had covered an entire wall in the bedroom. And in that moss, familiar symbols had begun to appear. The same runes I had seen on the ancient stones in the forest. I tried seeing a psychologist, thinking I was going crazy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a specialist in post-traumatic stress, and our sessions really helped. In her office, the voices of the forest would quiet down and the anxiety would subside. But as soon as I got home, it would start all over again. Maybe it's worth changing the environment, Dr. Mitchell suggested after a few sessions. Move to a different area. Find an apartment with bigger windows and better lighting. Sometimes our environment has a big impact on our mental state. I followed her advice and rented an apartment on the 23rd floor of a skyscraper in the business center. Glass walls, metal, concrete. No vegetation, no reminders of a forest. For the first week, I felt great. The plants disappeared. The dreams stopped. The green patterns on my skin became even paler. But 10 days later, I woke up to find a tree growing in the corner of the living room. Not a small sapling, but a full-fledged birch tree, about 2 meters tall. Its roots had grown through the concrete floor, and its branches touched the ceiling. It was impossible, but the tree stood there, alive and real, its leaves rustling softly in a non-existent wind. I called the manager, the plumber, even the city inspector. None of them had seen the tree. To them, the living room corner was empty, except for a few cracks in the floor, which they attributed to the building settling. But I saw the birch tree, heard the rustle of its leaves, smelled the bark and fresh leaves. Then I realized that distance didn't matter. The forest had found a way to reach me across hundreds of kilometers. Its roots stretched not only underground, but also through other dimensions, invisible connections that connected all life on the planet. You can't run away from yourself, Helen told me, appearing next to the birch tree one evening. She looked more real than before, almost human. But her skin still had a green tint and her eyes glowed a soft emerald. It's not me. It's what you're turning me into, I replied. The forest doesn't transform. She shook her head. It only reveals what's already inside. Humanity has tried to separate itself from nature for too long, but the connection never completely disappeared. It was just waiting for the right moment. The birch tree in the corner began to grow faster. Overnight, it stretched to the ceiling, and its branches began to grow through the plaster, looking for a way out. By morning, I discovered that the entire corner of the living room had turned into a small grove. In addition to the birch, a young pine tree, several bushes, and a whole carpet of moss had grown there. My neighbors on the same floor started complaining about strange sounds coming from my apartment. Rustling leaves, creaking branches, birds singing. But when the manager came to check, he found nothing unusual. For him, my apartment remained an ordinary dwelling with modern furniture and a minimalist design. I stopped going to work. What was the point of designing new buildings when you knew that sooner or later they would be swallowed up by vegetation? The architectural firm decided that I was having a nervous breakdown because of my wife's disappearance and offered me an unpaid leave. I accepted, although I knew I would not return. The days flowed into a continuous stream. I sat among the plants in my apartment and listened to their conversations. They told me about other cities where awakening had begun. Portland, Vancouver, even faraway Anchorage. People like me appeared everywhere, marked by the forest. Some resisted, others accepted their new nature. But the result was the same. The boundary between human civilization and wild nature was erased. One morning, I woke up to find that the entire apartment had been transformed into a forest clearing. The ceiling had disappeared, revealing a view of treetops and a patch of sky. The walls were covered in moss and lichen. The floor was covered in fallen leaves and small flowers. In the center of the room, a stream gurgled, originating from a crack where the kitchen sink had once been. And in those woods, Helen was waiting for me. She looked now as she had the last time I had seen her, in our house in Millfield. An ordinary woman with brown hair and green eyes. But I knew it was an optical illusion. The real Helen had long ago become part of something bigger. "It's time," she said, holding out her hand to me. "The forest is ready to accept you completely." I looked at my hands and saw that the green patterns had already covered my entire skin. They pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, and with each beat, I felt myself becoming more and more connected to the plants around me. Their life force flowed through me, and mine dissolved into their ancient wisdom. "What will happen to the rest of the people?" I asked. "The same as you," Helen answered. "Not all at once, but gradually. The forest is patient. It can wait for generations if it has to. But eventually it will all go back to the beginning, to the time when the earth was green and people understood their place in the great circle of life." I took her hand, and at that moment, I felt roots growing out of my legs, going deep into the earth. It didn't hurt. On the contrary, I felt an amazing sense of peace and unity. Through the roots, I could feel every tree within a radius of kilometers, every bush, every blade of grass. We were all parts of one huge organism that stretched across the entire continent. My hands began to turn into bark, my hair turned into moss, and my eyes took on the green hue of ancient leaves. But this was not death or becoming something alien. This was a return home. To the origins, to the state when man had not yet separated himself from nature. Through my new perception, I saw the entire world differently. Cities seemed like temporary growths on the planet, and their inhabitants like lost children who had forgotten their origins. But the oblivion was not permanent. In every big city, I felt points of awakening, places where the boundary between civilization and nature became thinner. Parks and gardens no longer seemed like decorations of the human world. They were springboards for the forest's advance, carefully disguised as harmless vegetation. And the people who looked after them, gardeners, landscape designers, simply flower lovers, became unwitting conductors of an ancient force. I have seen how in New York Central Park, an old oak tree begins to whisper to passers-by in a language they do not understand with their minds, but feel with their hearts. How in London, ivy on old buildings slowly destroys the brickwork, preparing the way for more aggressive plants. How in Tokyo, bamboo groves and temple gardens send signals through underground networks of roots, coordinating the actions of plants throughout the city. The process was not chaotic or destructive. The forest acted with the wisdom of millennia, understanding that too rapid change would lead to panic and resistance. Instead, it slowly, almost imperceptibly changed the consciousness of people, awakening in them ancient instincts and forgotten connections with nature. Some people were more receptive. Those who spent a lot of time in nature, worked with plants, or simply had a more subtle mental organization. They became the first guides, like me, like Helen, like all those whose portraits I saw in the ancient temple. Through them, the forest spread its influence further, touching friends, relatives, colleagues, not transforming them immediately, but simply sowing the seeds of future change, seeds that would grow when the time came. I felt my human identity slowly dissolving into the collective consciousness of the forest. Memories of my past life grew increasingly fuzzy, like a dream you forget minutes after waking. But that didn't scare me. In exchange, I was gaining access to the memories of the entire forest. Memories of a time when dinosaurs walked the earth, when the first plants emerged from the sea onto dry land, when the planet itself was just forming from cosmic dust. And in this ancient memory, I saw the future, not the apocalypse, not the end of humanity, but its transformation. In a few generations, the boundaries between cities and forests will disappear. People will live in harmony with plants, using their wisdom to create a new civilization. Not technogenic, but biological. Buildings will be grown, not built. Transportation will be replaced by networks of roots and vines that can move people and goods faster than any machine. Information will be transmitted through chemical signals from plants, creating a planetary communications network far more efficient than the internet. And those who cannot accept the changes will gradually disappear, not from violence or catastrophes, but simply because their way of life will become impossible in the new world. Just as the Neanderthals once disappeared, giving way to a more adaptive species. The last thing I remember as Michael Harrison was looking out the window of my 23rd floor apartment. Seattle lay below, a glitter of lights and metal. But through the concrete and asphalt, I could see green threads stretching from park to park, from garden to garden. The root system of a new world that had already enmeshed the planet and was waiting for the signal to finally awaken. This signal will sound soon. I felt its approach with every fiber of my new being. And when it sounds, humanity will take the next step in its evolution. Not to the stars as science fiction writers dreamed, but back to its roots, to unity with the planet that gave it life. And while I was growing, putting down new roots and waiting as the whole forest waited, patiently and inexorably as time waits. Deep within the ancient consciousness that I had become, time flowed differently. Days turned into years, years into decades. But each moment was filled with the life of thousands of plants, animals, and microorganisms, all part of a single ecosystem. I was no longer Michael Harrison. I was part of something immeasurably greater. Through the root networks, I watched the world change. At first, the changes were subtle. Trees in city parks grew faster than usual, flowers bloomed longer, and lawns grew thicker and greener. City officials attributed this to favorable weather or new fertilizers. But some people began to feel the difference. They spent more time in parks, sitting under trees for long periods, talking to plants. Colleagues and relatives dismissed this as eccentricity or an attempt to cope with the stress of modern life. They didn't understand that these people were simply responding to a call that was growing stronger every day. The first major city where the changes became obvious was Portland. There lived a woman named Sarah Collins, a botanist who worked at the local university. She studied the effects of the urban environment on plant growth and was the first to notice anomalies. Trees in the city center were growing 3 times faster than normal, their root systems expanding, destroying sidewalks and building foundations. "It's biologically impossible," she wrote in her research journal. "The plants behave as if they were receiving signals from some external source. They coordinate their actions. It's more like the behavior of a colonial organism than of an individual species." Sarah didn't know how close she was to the truth. Through a network of mycorrhizae, fungi, and roots, the forest transmitted information from city to city, from continent to continent. What had begun in small Millfield was now spreading across the planet. In Vancouver, local gardener Tom Anderson discovered that plants in a botanical garden had begun to grow in strict geometric shapes: spirals, mandalas, complex fractals. Visitors to the garden came to see this wonder, but many left with a feeling of deep peace and a desire to return. Some did not leave at all, spending days and nights among the plants, feeding only on dew and rainwater. In Anchorage, a fisherman named Jack Morrison told friends about how, while fishing on a remote lake, he saw trees that moved without the wind. Their branches reached out to him, as if inviting him to come closer. He resisted for hours, but eventually gave in and spent the night leaning against an ancient cedar. In the morning, he returned to town a changed man, quiet, thoughtful, spending all his free time in the woods. All these people, not knowing about each other,
became conductors of the ancient power. Through them, the forest expanded its influence, touching their loved ones, friends, colleagues, not transforming them immediately, but simply awakening in them something long forgotten, a connection with nature that slumbered in the genetic memory of each person. Government agencies began to notice something odd when disappearances began to increase in several cities at the same time. People would go into forests and parks and never return. Search parties would find their clothes and personal belongings, but never the missing persons themselves. The official explanation was an increase in suicides and mental disorders, but some investigators suspected a more complex picture. FBI agent Linda Hart was one of those trying to find a pattern in the disappearances. She made maps, analyzed data, interviewed witnesses, and gradually a frightening picture emerged before her. The disappearances were not chaotic, but rather had a pattern, spreading from small forest towns to large metropolises. "This looks like a contagion," she reported to her superiors, "or a coordinated operation by an unknown organization." But what kind of organization could operate on 3 continents at once? She didn't know that this organization had existed for millions of years, older than human civilization. The forest didn't need plans or meetings. Its actions were based on instincts honed by evolution over countless eons. By the end of the 2nd year after my transformation, even skeptics had noticed the changes. In New York, Central Park had grown beyond its official boundaries, its vegetation taking over nearby streets. Tree roots were destroying the asphalt, vines were entwining lampposts and traffic lights. City officials tried to combat the abnormal growth of vegetation, but for every branch cut, 10 new ones were replacing it. In London, ivy growing on historic buildings covered entire blocks in a matter of months. Tourists came to see Green London, not suspecting that, under the carpet of leaves, the old bricks were slowly crumbling, giving way to new, living architecture. In Tokyo, bamboo burst out of temple gardens and began growing right through concrete and asphalt. Overnight, entire streets were transformed into bamboo groves, and skyscrapers were hidden behind a wall of green trunks. The government declared a state of emergency, but the military could not fight an enemy that had no command and no headquarters. Meanwhile, the number of people who responded to the call of the forest grew exponentially. They came to the parks and forests with families, entire neighborhoods. Some resisted to the last, but most accepted the transformation with amazing calm, as if they had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. I felt each of them, as they joined the collective consciousness of the forest. Their human memories, knowledge, emotions, became part of the general flow of information. Engineers brought an understanding of technology, teachers, knowledge of how to transmit information, artists, a sense of beauty and harmony. All this added up to a new vision of the future. The forest had no intention of destroying human civilization. It wanted to transform it into something better, more harmonious. The knowledge of people helped it understand how to do this faster and more effectively. The first biological buildings grew in places where the concentration of the transformed was especially high. These were not just trees that took the form of houses, but complex living structures. Their walls filtered the air, their roots purified the water, and special chutes generated bioelectricity. The inside of such buildings maintained an ideal microclimate, and they themselves could grow, adapt to the needs of their inhabitants, and even move if necessary. People who still retained human form were initially afraid to enter these living houses, but those who dared to do so discovered that the plants did not cause harm. On the contrary, they provided comfort and safety better than any technical devices. Biological houses could cure diseases, predict the weather, and protect against natural disasters. The transportation network also began to change. Thick vines stretched between cities, creating living bridges and tunnels. They could be traveled at the speed of an express train,
using special capsules that the plants carried through a system of muscle contractions. This network did not require fuel, did not pollute the environment, and could function for thousands of years without maintenance. But the most amazing thing was the new communication system. Chemical signals transmitted through the roots and spores of fungi turned out to be much faster and more reliable than electronic networks. Anyone who maintained contact with plants could instantly receive information from anywhere on the planet. Not through screens and speakers, but directly into consciousness, as a memory or sudden insight. Governments of major countries tried to stop the process, but their efforts were in vain.
How can you fight a forest?
Armies could cut down trees, burn the grass, cover the ground with chemicals, but the roots went too deep. The spores were carried by the wind for thousands of kilometers, and the seeds sprouted in the most unexpected places. Moreover, the soldiers and technicians sent to destroy the plants often fell under their influence themselves. They returned from missions changed, calmer, more thoughtful, losing interest in military action. Many of them deserted, went into the forests, and never returned. 3 years after my transformation, it became clear that the old world was ending. Not through catastrophe or war, but through a gradual transformation. The great cities were turning into urban jungles, where skyscrapers supported giant trees and asphalt gave way to soft paths of intertwined roots. People who still retained their human form were divided into 3 groups. Some accepted the changes and learned to live in the new world without completely transforming but gaining the ability to communicate with plants. Others resisted and tried to preserve islands of the old civilization in bunkers and isolated settlements. The third, the wisest, voluntarily joined the forest, becoming a bridge between humanity and the new reality. And I watched all this from the depths of the collective consciousness, feeling how every day the planet became greener, more alive, more harmonious. Humanity did not disappear. It evolved, becoming part of something bigger. And perhaps, in thousands of years, the descendants of people, plants, and animals will create a civilization that previous generations could not even dream of. A civilization where every creature will know its place in the great symphony of life, where technology will be indistinguishable from biology, and the wisdom of the ages will be transmitted not through books and computers, but through the direct unity of consciousness. The story of Michael Harrison ended. The story of a new world began.